Make sure you guys hit the subscribe button if you guys are enjoying the content that we're throwing up. And make sure you guys hit the like button if you enjoy the video. And yeah, let's begin. Okay, so Marvel recently released a one-shot called Wolverine vs. Blade, or Blade vs. Wolverine. It's basically a special, it's a one-shot comic. Now here's the deal, for those people who have been paying attention to what Marvel's been doing, Marvel's been releasing a lot of content that features Blade, right? Like Blade's been appearing a lot. And usually Marvel does that when a character is going to appear in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, right? It's one of those things where like they just always kind of keep up with each other, and really like Marvel Comics kind of serves as a preview for what's to come for the MCU. Blade's on the Avengers now, like Blade and Wolverine are receiving like a team up, and Wolverine is one of the most popular characters right now, so of course copying the Fantastic Four theme from the 1960s, you put Blade with Wolverine and then just kind of call it a day. But this is not the first time the two of them have ever teamed up or really even met. The reality is that Blade was always a character who kind of free floated out there in Marvel for like a number of years, right? I think Blade really was the most popular in like the 1990s, really, when it was like super high octane stories, so like Cable and all those guys, and like Wolverine, like the anti-hero element. Blade had dropped off really when the 1990s ended, going into like the 2000s, and so he was really just sort of there. Marvel tried to beef up his popularity with the 5th volume of his character, and it was actually in issue number 5 that they said that like Wolverine and Blade had actually met when Blade was younger in Philadelphia, and the trench coat and everything he wears, it really was an outfit that originally belonged to Wolverine that was given to Blade. So it was kind of interesting, kind of a weird little retcon, not super important, but what this does is it actually kind of capitalizes on an old story from back in the day, like from volume 5. And the idea of Wolverine and Blade teaming up really comes by way of them facing off against a group called the Creed. Now, when it comes to vampires in Marvel Comics, vampires usually always stick in like groups, right? Like groups or herds or whatever you want to call them. And in this instance, it's simply just a group called the Creed. Now, at the time that they had faced off against them, the Creed was just one of several groups that Blade was getting into a conflict with, and Wolverine was basically along for the ride. But it doesn't last very long, right? I mean, like this fight lasts, maybe a couple pages, and like the Creed are essentially like all but destroyed, and like Wolverine, his shoulders cut, like a chunk of his shoulders cut off, and it doesn't really matter. I mean, he takes through and takes care of the vampires pretty quickly, and it ends pretty fast. And then following this, we jump forward 6 months later. Now, this is where things get intriguing, because with this 6-month jump, what we end up getting into is the fact that like there's a character by the name of Dragoness who's brought in, and she was actually really a member of the Mutant Liberation Front. Now, the Mutant Liberation Front was an organization that was popularized and created in the early 1990s with the launch of X-Force coming off of New Mutants, and even then, maybe a little bit before New Mutants, but it was basically Strife's mutant terrorist organization. But the idea here is that Dragoness has basically been turned into a vampire, and that's essentially it. Now, along the way, when Wolverine's tracking her down and when Wolverine goes after her, what he ends up finding is like this giant box, right, with like kind of a skull looking thing on it. And so of course, logically, he takes it to Doctor Strange. Now, while all that goes on, you've also got Blade continuing to do his own thing. Now again, Blade was always kind of an outlier. Blade was always sort of fighting vampires. And unless you were really following like the darker side of Marvel, right? So like the Werewolf by Night, like the monster themed element of Marvel Comics, which not a lot of people did, then you wouldn't really be familiar with like Blade and the whole vampire side of things. Again, he was really always kind of like in his own world. But of course, him facing off against this guy, Count Von Stadt out in Germany somewhere. Von Stadt, it turns out, basically has like laser eyes. Like he's got heat vision, at least it seems like. And it's kind of weird because vampires never really have that kind of stuff. In Marvel Comics, vampires don't really have abilities like that. Vampires are a lot more straightforward. They only ever really come out at night. They can be killed by stakes and silver and so on and so forth. Like these things that are the traditional vampire mythos to a degree. I mean, not everything works, like a stake through the heart works, things along those lines. But this guy is essentially just kind of like some grand poobah here. And when Blade asks the question where he got his powers from, where he has these abilities from, of course, Von Stadt refuses to answer, and Blade leaves him in the sunlight, and he basically burns alive. It's pretty straightforward. I mean, it's not overly complicated. I don't know how to go super in-depth into this. One thing that is intriguing about this, though, is the nature of Blade. So, when it came to Blade's character in Marvel, one of the things that you had to remember was that he was almost kind of a by any means necessary sort of guy, right? I mean, he wouldn't really like hold an innocent person as a hostage against a vampire. That's not really something that he would do. But when it comes to vampires, it's I will kill them by any means necessary, and he doesn't really care, right? Like if you were turned into a vampire, then he'll kill you. That's really the way it is. Whether it's like an X-Man or an Avenger or whatever the case is, like he'll go after you because it's the main charter of his character. It's his main mission. It's what he does. And so one of the things that he ends up finding out is that where he and Wolverine previously believed they destroyed the Creed, that instead this guy has a Creed marking on his chest. And the result is that the assumption or the belief is that the Creed is still alive and functioning. So switching over to Wolverine joining Doctor Strange, again, this is kind of an interesting scenario because it's really Mark Guggenheim kind of building on the Doctor Strange mythos, right? Like when it comes to Stephen Strange, I mean, he is the Sorcerer Supreme. Really in this day and age, he's more the Sorcerer Supreme by name only as opposed to power, right? I mean, if we were talking about about Doctor Strange in like the 1980s, like 1970s or 1980s, then we would say by virtue of power, because he was just that powerful, he could do pretty much anything. But after the War of the Nine Realms, I think it was, when the Vishanti took away like 60% of his power and then gave a portion of it back, but not all of it, he's kind of been depowered ever since. And so he's not nearly as powerful as he was back in the day, right? Like he can't do everything, he can't do anything he wants to. There are limits to his power. But when we think about Doctor Strange, we usually only ever really think of like magic and mysticism. Now, those who are very, very experienced readers do know that he was part of that whole darker side of Marvel, right? I mean, you know, Werewolf by Night and all that kind of good stuff. They know that he was part of that darker kind of demonic side of Marvel for a while. The information that's available in that part of the Marvel universe is available to Doctor Strange, and he knows about it, right? So he's not like walking around oblivious to the nature of vampires. It's just something he doesn't deal with all too often. Now, when Marvel launched the 1990s version of the Defenders, which was basically just a series of stories where Doctor Strange had what amounted to like a Black Ops team that was composed of like different members, like Wolverine and different things like that they had fought threats that you wouldn't normally see in a Doctor Strange story. And it was actually really cool for the time. If they brought it back, it could work exceedingly well, right? I mean, Doctor Strange has a revolving team of characters that consists of like the Fantastic Four or some members of the Avengers. Like imagine Doctor Strange and like the Incredible Hulk and like Wolverine and Cyclops and I don't know, Johnny Storm, who go on some mission somewhere to fight some demonic entity or something along those lines. It'd be interesting, and it'd actually be pretty intriguing if it was done correctly. The problem in the 1990s is that for the most part, it was not done correctly, and so that's why it wasn't all that great. But Doctor Strange basically says this particular artifact, this box, houses a whole bunch of magical energy that is vampiric in nature and has been designed to essentially like keep it closed. But of course, Doctor Strange, being the Sorcerer Supreme, can open it up. Now, when he starts saying things about like the Creed and about like Varkus and things like that, this is one, him showing that he knows what's going on to a degree, but two, for the most part, it's really beneath Doctor Strange to get involved. And that's the question that a lot of people would probably ask. If Doctor Strange is aware of all this, then why doesn't he act? Well, because there's no real reason for him to. There's more important things going on out there in the realm of like magic and mysticism than like vampires out in the west or out in the east somewhere or wherever it is they happen to be. But what Stephen Strange says is that the entire vampire community, and really like, I guess really just the Creed for the most part, has what's called Varkus. And Varkus is basically like their messiah. Now, we can largely assume that when it comes to like messianic figures in vampire mythology, that for the most part, they kind of have different messiahs on, you know, who they deem to be the actual god. But there really kind of has to be a god above gods with regards to like how the vampires function and how they work. Now, this is kind of manifested in various forms over the years. Most recently, this does kind of look like Varkus, right? Like Varkus is like the vampire above all vampires. But we don't really know what this has to do with anything. All we know is that the death of Varkus basically comes by way of Wolverine himself, who seems to be the one to kill him. And so when you switch over to Blade, Blade's basically interrogating a guy named Desmond, and Desmond really spills the beans of the other half of the equation. That the prophecy states that Varkus is basically a mutant turned into a vampire. And so because that's the reason why Count Von Stad had you know, heat vision or concussive blast, whatever you want to call them, is because what the Creed had been doing was running around and turning mutants into vampires under the belief that they could basically awaken Varkus. They could discover who Varkus actually is and discover their messiah. So it's really kind of a dangerous game, because when you end up having Wolverine and then you have Blade basically track down the Creed to their location, they both arrive there and each one thinks the other's Varkus. Now, the reality of this is that it's kind of thin and it's not the best writing ever. Wolverine and Blade are not like the sharpest tools in the shed, right? I mean, you know, they're operating on, you know, on like 90% or not even 90%, maybe like 80% capacity, right? But they're by no means like stupid. And so it seems kind of weird to put them in a situation to where they would both show up here, and because Varkus had a sword and because Wolverine was killing Varkus, that they each interpreted it as the other, right? It's just kind of like, okay, that's silly. If anything, I would say this was just done for the purpose of giving us a fight between Blade and Wolverine. And the fight for the most part is actually pretty evenly matched. And it's interesting the way that it's done, because under normal expectations, you would look at this and you would expect Wolverine to win. You'd expect him to win like that, like in like quick, fast, and in a hurry, with no real indication that Blade could actually win. But remember, when, you know, in the time they've met over the years, Wolverine taught Blade a few things. Not only that, you also have Blade's abilities in the fact that he's half vampire, so that kind of boosts what it is that he can do. At the same time, Wolverine kind of goes into this like, okay, you know, let's battle a little bit, but his heart's not necessarily into it. You know, when this blade gets thrown by Wolverine, ultimately, like, Wolverine realizes, hey, this is one of the blades that Blade uses in order to kill a vampire. He thinks I'm a vampire, and that's when the two of them kind of stop fighting and reconcile. I mean, I don't know if this is really designed to answer the question who would win, Wolverine versus Blade, because the fight kind of ends before it starts. But one of the things that I want you guys to notice here in terms of how Blade looks is Blade looks like Michael Jai White. And it's kind of crazy because, again, like, Marvel does that when they're bringing characters into the MCU. I think Michael Jai White would be an amazing Blade. Like, dude, okay, here's the thing. Michael Jai White is a legit martial artist, right? Like, he's this really, really cool guy. He's like a 7th degree black belt or something like that. He's been studying martial arts for like 21 years. Like, dude, the guy's a legit fighter, right? And I mean, like, make him Blade. Like, I think he'd be an amazing Blade. He'd be my pick, right? He'd be my pick because the guy has to be able to move and fight and pull off the kind of stunts that Blade needs to be able to pull off. If you've never seen Michael Jai White in action, you need to go look at his movies. Like, you need to go look him up. The guy is a legit fighter. Like, he's a multi-tournament champ. It's pretty cool. But in any event, this basically leads to like the arrival of Varkus himself. And that's when we end up finding out here that what happened was that when the chunk of Wolverine's shoulder was cut off, that what the Kree did is they used it to basically clone a new Wolverine. And when they did that, they basically said like, this is our new messiah, essentially. Like, we've got Wolverine now, we've got a vampire with a healing factor. Like, this is our thing. Now, this works because there is actually a what if story where Wolverine becomes a vampire and turns the rest of the world into vampires, I'm pretty sure. But the fight ends like really fast, right? I mean, like, it's not even that long at all. It's like a couple pages. And that's kind of the issue you run into with stories like this, where Blade and Wolverine team up and they say, okay, you attack from below, I'll attack from high, and they cut off his head and gut him at the same time and he just dies. The problem you run into with stories like this is it's really done more for either boosting a character or for just like showing us a depiction of a battle between two characters. But the issue with doing something like this is it takes away from the story, right? Because if Marvel starts dumping a whole bunch of Blade material based on the idea that they want to get Blade out there because he's going to be in the MCU, but all the material that comes out from Blade sucks, then people aren't going to care about him when he comes into the MCU. Instead, like, if I were them, I would reprint the old Blade stories. The Blade stories back in the day, like Blade volumes 1, 2, and 3, they were legit. Like, they were awesome. By the time you got to 4 and 5, they sucked. But like Blades 1, 2, and 3, like, they were awesome. Like, they were great stories from back in the day. And I would just reprint them or like basically just like continue on from like the original Blade series and just sort of like nix 2 and 3 if they wanted to. But nonetheless, it's interesting. It's a cool little story insofar as like Blade and Wolverine team up and fight each other. But it's, again, like, for the most part, it's just kind of not the best thing ever to come out of Marvel. So with that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.